Everyone's favorite talking point regarding mergers and acquisitions is the valuation. The question is, how is my firm going to be valued? So let's unpack that and go through the math. So let's talk about valuations. Easily the most popular topic when we have introductory calls with firms who are otherwise considering a partnership, but there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about how firms are valued. The first thing that I would want to say is that most sophisticated buyers are not going to buy your practice based on a revenue multiple, a gross revenue multiple. We see those thrown about, 2 to 3 times gross revenue as standard metrics. Those are nice for rules of thumb, but no one's going to buy your business on a gross revenue multiple. It doesn't tell them anything about your profitability. You could have 2 firms that are each doing $1 million in gross revenue. One is producing $500,000 of net, one is producing $200,000 of net. So wildly different profitability, they're not worth the same, and that's what a gross revenue multiple would tell you. So the valuation is going to be derived by applying a multiple to your net income, your free cash flow, otherwise called EBITDA. And so the question becomes, how do we derive what our EBITDA is? I would tell you all buyers are different in this regard, but if you understand this basic mathematical formula, you're well on your way to understanding how they're deriving a value. The first thing that we want to do is understand what is your gross revenue. And here it's important to know what component of your gross revenue is being derived from recurring revenue. So recurring revenue would be fee income. It would be any commission income that has a trail, like a variable annuity commission or a 12B1 fee. It could also be planning fees if you're billing them on a consistent basis year over year. So that's recurring revenue. Non-recurring revenue would be the next source of revenue. That's simply any one-time commission, any one-off project-related fee, that sort of thing. The reason we want to distinguish between the two is because recurring revenue will receive a higher multiple than non-recurring revenue, if any. Most firms, they're going to really scrutinize any non-recurring revenue to see if there's a pattern, a history of producing that. And if they're going to apply a multiple at all, it would typically be about half of what you would expect from recurring revenue. So let's take a scenario where we had $1 million of recurring revenue. For math simplicity, let's just work from that. The next thing we would understand is what is your operating expenses, or OpEx. In this definition, operating expenses would be all costs associated with your business, with the exception of the owners. So we're going to remove any owner's compensation, whether it be salary, distribution, whether it be any qualified plan contributions, even perks that you're running through the business, perhaps a car payment or a beach house or something like that. We'll remove all of that from operating expenses, so you're left with rent, salary, technology, vendor costs, custodial fees, things like that. Normally, we would expect to see around 30 to 40% in operating expenses, as I just defined. So on that $1 million of recurring revenue, let's say we had 40% OpEx, so $400,000. So $1 million of revenue, subtract $400,000 of OpEx would leave $600,000 of gross profits. Here's your first M&A term. They also call gross profits EBOC, earnings before owner's compensation. It's gross profits, but in M&A jargon, we refer to that as EBOC. So if that's your current P&L, the next step is going to be what we call a recast of your P&L. The buyer is interested to see if there's any operating synergies as a result of the partnership. So they're going to look at your P&L on the expense side and go line by line, removing certain P&L expenditures in your current world and layering in their cost. So for example, you have a technology stack today. They're going to remove that cost of your technology and they're going to layer in theirs. They're going to remove your cost for employee benefits. They're going to layer in theirs. And so they just go line by line, making these adjustments into your P&L. Sometimes we would expect to see some reduction in your operating expenses. It makes sense. The larger firm, they typically, because given their size, the same vendor cost, they would be able to buy at a lower price point just because of their size. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary that during this recast step, there's anywhere from a 5 to as high as 30% in operating expense reductions. The major categories would be items that they remove from your P&L that they don't allocate any corporate overhead. Compliance is usually a big one here. It could also be, again, those adjustments to vendor or custodial cost. It could also be staff eliminations or reductions. Just know that if we are talking about headcount reduction, that's typically you making that decision. As we've shared in previous videos, the buyer is not looking to reduce headcount. So going through this recast step, the first thing, you just want it to be transparent. You want to see all the adjustments they're making. It's not, if there's a firm that's doing a valuation and they're not showing you this step, this recast step, it's not necessarily indicative of anything bad, but all things being equal, I would really prefer to see the adjustments they're making. It tells you a lot about how they're thinking about P&L. Sometimes they may be adding expenses to your P&L. We commonly see firms who aren't marketing a lot, that the buyer wanting to implement some marketing will add some marketing dollars to your P&L. Again, if it's transparent, you get to see how they're thinking about it. So going back to my example, we had $1 million of gross revenue, recurring revenue, and $400,000 of operating expenses in your current business. Going through this recast step, we would expect to see that operating expense line reduced. So maybe $350,000 as much as $300,000. So the same $1 million of gross revenue, now the recasted operating expenses is $300,000. The net effect is gross profits, or EBOC, went up by that savings. So if it was $100,000 in savings, your EBOC would go up from $600,000 to $700,000. So that's the first really complexity of the valuation, is understanding that recast step. The next step is, once we've done the recast, you as the owner have to determine how much of that EBOC, that gross profit, do you want to retain for your compensation. There's really two things to consider here. The first being, what do you need to meet your living expenses? I would tell you that you want to retain enough of your compensation such that your living expenses are comfortably met. Don't try to lower your comp that would make you stretch or uncomfortable in any way. The second notion would be their buyer is going to want you to retain a minimum amount of compensation. They refer to that as a replacement cost. What their concern is here is if something catastrophic happened to you, they would need to go hire your replacement. And so they want you to retain enough such that if something did happen to you, that they could take those dollars and go hire your replacement. It's somewhat geographically determined. For example, it's more expensive to hire an advisor in Silicon Valley than it would be in Fargo, North Dakota. So those are the two things to be concerned. That's the second leverage point in the valuation, is whatever your recasted EBOC is, how much of that do you keep for your owner's compensation? So I'll pick a number for brevity. Let's say it's $300,000. So we had $700,000 of recasted EBOC. Now we're going to subtract your retained owner's compensation, in this case $300,000. The net would be $400,000. That is net income. They also refer to that as EBITDA. That is where the valuation multiple will be applied. And so this is where it is, of course, a negotiating point. Firms are different. I would tell you today, as we sit here in February of 2022, current EBITDA ranges between $500,000 to $1 million typically are going to be in that 6 to 7.5 times range. $1 million to $2 million of EBITDA would be in that 7 to 8, maybe 8.5 range. $2 million to $3 million, you're in that 8 to 10 range, and anything above $3 million should be at 10 plus. But those are normative ranges, and what puts you at the high end or low end of the range typically tends to be more qualitative in nature. How strategically important is your market? You know, what's your growth rates been? What's your average client profile look like? Are they older? Are they younger? You know, things like this that tend to make your practice more attractive versus less attractive. So that's how valuations work. Once you have the number, whatever the valuation is, then it's what form of currency do you want to take? So if there was $400,000 of EBITDA, and let's say you got a 6x multiple, 6 times 400 would be a $2.4 million valuation. Now it's, what do you want to take? Cash? Do you want to take equity? You'll be offered most commonly the ability to roll some of that valuation into equity. Some offer deferred cash, where you can take cash, but it's paid over time so that you can spread out your tax liability. So that's the basic mathematical formula. Everyone tweaks that to their own unique model, but I think if you understand that basic flow, you have a good understanding on valuations. Of course, now, once we've done the valuation, there's an ongoing share of economics. It's really firm dependent. Some firms will pay you a percentage of top line revenue as you grow. Some will pay you a percentage of profits of that EBOC split. Some will pay you a salary plus bonus structure. It's really all over the board. But they will want you to have a strong incentive to grow. That's what this is all about. When firms are acquiring a practice, they want to see that asset grow. And so in any scenario, you're going to have a very strong incentive to continue growing. So that's a quick brief on how valuations are done. Happy to dive into that one-on-one with you if you have any questions or want to know how that would pertain to your unique situation. Don't hesitate to reach out and get in touch. Thank you. I'm Alan Darby, CEO of Alaris Acquisitions. I'm looking forward to meeting you soon.